Welcome to History Secrets Uncovered. My name is Jay Chandarana, and today I have the privilege of speaking with Professor Erik Mathisen, a historian of the Civil War and Reconstruction era at Western Washington University. In today's conversation, we'll examine how citizenship was contested and reshaped during Reconstruction, how Black political activism influenced the meaning of democracy, and why the struggles of that era continue to shape debates about rights and belonging today. Professor Mathisen, thank you so much for joining me.
Nice to be here. Thanks, Jay.
Well, to start, what first drew you to studying the Civil War and Reconstruction, particularly questions about citizenship and loyalty?
I think some of it had to do with where I'm from. I'm Canadian by birth, and I'm giving away my age, but I kind of came of age as a young person at around about the same time as the separatist movement in Quebec was heating up. And there were a series of referendums that in which Quebec came very close to separating from Canada. And that got me really interested in kind of historical parallels and trying to understand how that could happen, why it could happen, what the kind of preconditions of it were, and how I might understand it. And that kind of naturally led me to American history, and in particular to the collapse of the United States in 1861. As far as the question of citizenship and loyalty are concerned, I think that came a lot later for me. So that was while I was in graduate school in the US. And at the time when I was in graduate school, there were a lot of studies being published about the history of gender and gender studies. There was a lot of interest in those topics, and questions of citizenship kind of naturally led to that. So trying to understand how it is that women are conceived of as citizens in American history, but also as dependents to a husband or head of a household, and the kind of relationships that emerge out of that. So I got really interested in citizenship, kind of coming from my reading of those books, and the question of loyalty really popped up as I was doing research for my PhD dissertation, of which the book is based. So I was reading an awful lot of letters and diaries and various things by 19th century Americans who talked a lot about loyalty, their loyalty to one another, their loyalty to the government, their imagined loyalty, what they imagined their relationship was to this weird, far off thing, this kind of enormous nation state, which they really could barely conceive of at the time. The Civil War was the moment in which the kind of modern American state was built. And Americans they didn't always find it easy to understand what that was or how it worked. And loyalty became a language that they could use to make sense of it, I think.
When you were studying the Civil War and kind of some of the precursors up to the Civil War, did you see any similarities between that and the Quebec separatist movement, or did you almost view them as two different things entirely as you did more research on them?
Yeah, there were a lot of similarities. I think a lot of it had to do with uh, how Southerners in the 1860s kind of attempted to make sense of their region, as something separate and apart from the rest of the Republic. Prior to the 1840s and 50s and things like that, there had been people who talked about Southernness and Southern culture as being somehow separate. But it wasn't really until the 1850s that you started to see people draw really sharp lines between the two regions.
Yeah.
And I found, at any rate, that was. I mean, I was in my early teens, I guess, when the referendums were happening in Quebec. But you saw something similar there too, right? So Quebec governments sort of instituting language laws and things like that, where they were sort of attempting to protect Quebecois, the language of the province,
Yeah.
versus the encroachment of English into Quebec culture. So that kind of policing of culture was really interesting to me, and I saw some parallels between the two regions, and on that point at any rate.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I guess back to the Civil War, when most students learn about the Reconstruction era, it's often presented as a short and a failed kind of period. From your
Yeah.
perspective, what does this narrative get right and what does it miss?
Yeah, I think that's right. That the kind of overwhelming sort of interpretation of Reconstruction is that it was brief and that it was overwhelmingly a failure, and it failed depending on your perspective. In the early 20th century, as kind of Jim Crow segregation was heating up, Reconstruction became a really hot topic of debate for a lot of people, principally because it gave the Jim Crow system an origin story, a reason for being. And in that respect, Reconstruction failed because it elevated African Americans to a position of power when, according to this old interpretation, it didn't have they didn't have the ability to grab hold of that power and use it effectively, that they were easily corrupted and all this sort of thing. So it's a thoroughly racist interpretation of African Americans. And Birth of a Nation is a perfect example of that, right?
Yeah.
So Reconstruction failed because African Americans were incapable of succeeding. But the other side of it is that Reconstruction failed not because of what African Americans couldn't do, but instead what they weren't allowed to do or that what they weren't able to do. So it failed because they weren't given the full measure of their citizenship. They weren't given the means, the economic means to enjoy the political rights and protect political rights that they had won for themselves in the wake of the Civil War. So those ideas are really powerful, and I think they do touch on some important points, which is to say, it is true that African Americans weren't given the kind of the broadest kind of economic rights to match their political match the vote, which they would win in the wake of the war. But I think a lot of the narrative about how Reconstruction or did Reconstruction fail, I think one of the things it misses is that it doesn't connect the story that we ought to tell about the Reconstruction period in the wake of the war to what follows it well past the point when we typically think of it as a failure. To call it a failure means that we should understand it, but ultimately dismiss it. That it wasn't a consequential part of American history. It was just
Sure.
a brief moment, and actually, it was a lot more powerful than that. For one thing, African Americans voted in numbers right up through the 1870s and 1880s. They continued to vote well past the point when we typically think of Reconstruction as ending.
Yeah.
um, Jim Crow laws, so segregation, disfranchisement, all of those things, those were legal building blocks that weren't put into place until around about the turn of the 20th century. Um, and on top of all that, when African Americans thought about their history, they invariably thought about Reconstruction as being very important to them, very important to their past. When civil rights protesters in the 1950s and 60s talked about their movement, they talked about it as the second Reconstruction. They talked
Yeah.
about it as just the next chapter. So for them, it was really powerful and it was really important. So I think the whole idea of it as being a failed period, it gets some things right, but it doesn't do enough to underscore just how consequential Reconstruction was, because arguably even more than the war itself, so many of the questions that the war threw up wouldn't be answered until in the decades that followed the actual conflict.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I'm thinking right now about Booker T. Washington, who is largely doesn't love segregation, but thinks it's a necessary means for Black people. And I'm just wondering, like, is that a kind of more common thought than just him? And almost
Mm.
the segregation wasn't as terrible of a thing to some Black people at the time as we kind of look at that situation today.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a real thick thread of self-reliance that goes into an awful lot of African American history that we sometimes miss in our effort to focus so much attention on things like the civil rights movement and on questions of equality and that sort of thing. There's long been a tension in African American history between equality on the one hand and wanting to be separate and independent on the other. And as you say, whether it's Booker T. Washington or Marcus Garvey or Malcolm X or any number of other figures. And you can go back into Reconstruction and see that too. When African Americans, when some of them at any rate, talked about what they wanted from their freedom in the wake of the Civil War, they said we want independence and we want some land and we want to be left alone. And that's our most important. That's the
Yeah.
thing that we want more than anything else. Um, there is that in African American history, and I think if we sever the Reconstruction period from the rest of African American history, we miss just how long-standing that thread is, how long that is, and how much it
Yeah.
ties a lot of Black history together.
Yeah, thank you. And then back on the topic of citizenship and loyalty, in your work, The Loyal Republic, you argue that the idea of citizenship was also deeply tied to ideas of loyalty. Um, what did it mean to be considered loyal in this period, and why did that matter so much?
Yeah, I think it mattered a lot to Americans for different reasons. Prior to the Civil War, what it meant to be a citizen of the United States was a fairly opaque thing. It wasn't very clear. Um, there was no definition of citizenship written into the Constitution. There was no sense of who an American was. It wasn't a specific legal category. The federal government could create citizens through naturalization. It could create citizens out of people who had emigrated to the country, but it wasn't entirely clear what the title meant, and that was left up to individual states to decide. They would decide what the privileges of citizenship would be. So Americans entered the Civil War without really understanding or having a clear sense of who an American was. And the Civil War would drive a sharp wedge in between Americans and force them in many ways to choose sides. So in northern states, and certainly in the United States, after it had been kind of cut off from the rest of the republic, the the northern states talked about loyalty a lot because they worried that there were people within their own population who were loyal not to the United States but instead to the Confederacy. And in the South, there were just as many worries about that, not simply because they weren't entirely sure that white Southerners, many of whom didn't own enslaved people, that white Southerners wouldn't necessarily be completely loyal to the Confederate cause. And they also worried about the 4 odd million African Americans whose loyalty was up in the air too. They didn't know. They couldn't know, not
Yes.
really. So loyalty began to matter almost the moment that the war started. And in for different reasons and in different ways, both the United States and the Confederacy, when they thought about loyalty and citizenship at all, and they started to in the immediate aftermath of secession, they started to fuse the two ideas together so that one would be the litmus test for the other. Your loyalty, if you could demonstrate it, your loyalty would be the thing that would give you access to citizenship rights. Um, and this became kind of a move in both countries that would be hugely consequential. For one thing, it gave African Americans, enslaved people, an opportunity to declare their citizenship by demonstrating their loyalty to the United States and fighting as soldiers. And that became their path to citizenship. So it wasn't necessarily the case that the United States was just going to bestow citizenship rights automatically on African Americans. That was not talked about in the Emancipation Proclamation, but African Americans anticipated it. They anticipated a post-war moment in which it would be harder to deny them rights as citizens if they could demonstrate their loyalty having served as soldiers. Um, so it becomes a really powerful fusion of ideas. Ultimately, it would become a very difficult thing to demonstrate, though, and a hard thing to prove, right? So if you're a Union officer and you're going into an occupied territory and you want to find out who's loyal and who isn't, well, how do you judge that if, in a given community?
Yeah.
How do you know who's loyal and who isn't? Who do you have to rely on? Whose word do you have to rely on to demonstrate who's loyal and who's not? It became a real a really tangled web of relationships and worries on the part of officers, and that would only get worse as the war moved on.
Well, we talked about loyalty as almost a litmus test for citizenship. How did the debates over loyalty influence who was included in or excluded from political community?
I think a lot of the inclusiveness of loyalty can be found in things like in the African American experience. So when they talked about why they were serving and why they were willing to endure in the military so many denigrating policies, right? African American soldiers weren't paid as much as white soldiers. They weren't allowed to serve as officers. There were all kinds of kind of baldly racist policies that were at work there. And a lot of African Americans protested against it, and rightly so. But a fair few of them made it plain that they were willing to put up with these things if it demonstrated their loyalty, if it demonstrated that they were there to fight for the Union, they were there to fight for the United States, they believed in the cause, particularly once emancipation was on the table. And they were willing to do all those things if it meant at the end that they would get something in return.
Yeah.
As far as in the white South is concerned, it became a really a much more difficult thing to judge because certainly by the time you get to the end of the Civil War, now with a collapsed nation and occupied by the United States, the white Southerners were sort of on the outside looking in. They couldn't demonstrate their loyalty. Everyone knew that they had been disloyal. In fact, arguably to some, they'd been treasonous. They'd committed treason against the country. So they kind of find themselves on the outskirts, on the periphery of a new kind of political order, ironically, one in which African Americans are at their center. So it really does change the way that politics were practiced, and it really altered, at least for a time, altered the the, the sort of composition of this new political system that emerges in the wake of the war.
Yeah, and I think that ties in perfectly with the idea of Reconstruction and how African Americans, your work emphasizes, were not passive in the process of rebuilding this broken nation. What are some examples that you might have of black communities actively shaping and reshaping the political change that came during that period?
Yeah, they were anything but passive, as you say. They were they showed a real canny awareness of how power works in a society. We tend to assume that African Americans, at least in the traditional way we talk about American history, we say African Americans were sort of they were sort of bystanders, right? They weren't the ones who were making history. They were just watching history happen. But actually, in the wake of the war, particularly, African Americans grab hold of this new opportunity presented to them by their demonstration of loyalty, and they use it in all kinds of different ways. For one thing, they take active part in the building of a Republican Party in the former Confederate South, a
Yeah.
party which had barely existed, if at all, in most Confederate states. By the time you get to 1865, 1866, African Americans are actively participating in the building of a new political organization. And it was their loyalty to the Republican Party, their stated preference for the party of Lincoln over that of any other, that was going to give them access to power, not just at the federal level, but also at the state and local level too. Um, African Americans were also very, very active in electing their own to positions of elected office as well.
Yeah.
And this is something I think that a lot of people traditionally have discounted. But there were hundreds of former Confederate counties that, in the wake of the war, and after the Reconstruction amendments were put in place, the 14th Amendment in particular, there were hundreds of counties in which African Americans served in local office. They served as tax collectors and sheriffs and justices of the peace, and all of those sort of seemingly unimportant municipal offices, um, which are anything but unimportant in the fabric of day to day life in for most Black communities. It's all well and good to have a member of Congress who looks like you in Washington. It's just as important, if not more so, to have a justice of the peace who looks like you and who's going to support your community, or a sheriff who's going to support your community. So African Americans were really canny about that, and they showed a real awareness of how power works in a post-war society, and they used it to the fullest extent. I mean, they were really, really their contribution to Reconstruction was enormous.
And I think that's kind of why you see a dichotomy between people's perspective of Reconstruction as a failure versus success, because I think the general consensus is that yes, after Reconstruction happened, there's a brief period of change and progress, but then all the former Confederates were kind of reelected and put back into positions of power. But
Yeah,
positions of power were, like you were saying, were at the state level, but that shouldn't discredit all the amounts of now Black people who were elected and were put into positions of their own forms of power, even if it wasn't as high of a level. And I think that might be
yeah.
where some of the big differences between people who view Reconstruction as a failure versus as progress kind of come from.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right about that. I think the issue of local power is really important. And yeah, if you were to see it as an index of success for African Americans, that would be a much better, I think, index of how African Americans used their power and attempted to wield power for change. One of the really interesting things that I think Reconstruction historians have come to is an awareness that, in the wake of the war, and particularly by 1867, 1868, the traditional story is that, as you say, whites were reinstalled back into power, and the Ku Klux Klan emerges, and you have all these kind of white vigilante groups who
Yeah.
are wreaking havoc on Black communities, and there's no question that they were there, and there's equally, as you say, no question that they were put back. Whites were put back into power up to a point, but white vigilante violence happened almost not universally, but more often than not, only in places where African Americans made up a minority of a county or a given region.
Sure,
In
yeah.
places in places where they made up the majority of the population, white vigilante violence was not non-existent, but it was sporadic at best. And the reason why is because even white vigilantes understood that if they were to go into a county that was dominantly African American, they weren't likely going to come out alive from, no matter what they might be planning.
Yeah, yeah.
That African Americans were still armed, that they were still quite militant, that they were still willing to protect their communities at all costs, that they weren't going to back down, And in cases where they were numerically dominant, white vigilantes thought better of it. So you do get that kind of that alternate history, if you like, of Reconstruction when you
Yeah.
start to see what was going on in individual places as opposed to the nation as a whole.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about power, we inherently have to talk about freedom as well. And I think a question that I have is, was there tension between how black Americans understood freedom and how white political leaders, whether that be in the South or the North, defined it?
Yeah. I think there was a tension. It didn't emerge. It didn't emerge very clearly at first, but it was there. African Americans conceived of their rights as being political rights married with economic rights.
Hmm.
They saw that no right to vote was worth very much if it didn't come along with an economic independence that would allow them to use that vote and use it in a way that was judicious and in a way that was protected.
Hmm.
Um, and that was a lot different from how a lot of white Americans saw it. White Americans envisaged freedom for African Americans as being the most that the country ought to do and the most that the country should do for this one group, for African Americans. And the gap between those two kind of definitions of freedom, one in which you're given freedom and nothing else, and the other in which you're given freedom as well as the other tools that you need in order to live an independent life. That became very apparent by the time you get to the year and a half, 2 years into Reconstruction, that gap was large and it was only growing. Um, the other big problem with Reconstruction, I think, and this is something that you only see when you take a big step back from US history, is that Reconstruction was taking place at a time when imperialism around the world was heating up and where ideas about scientific racism were beginning to order so much of how people thought about the globe. And Reconstruction became harder and harder to sustain when it became clear that the kind of worldview, particularly of those in power, had it that white Anglo-Saxons were dominating the globe and that they were meant to rule and that they were scientifically, supposed to be in a position of dominance over that of people of color. And that the emergence of that idea made Reconstruction very, very hard to sustain because it felt like you were pushing against the ocean. If you were supporting the freedom and political power for African Americans, you were doing so by the time you get to the 1870s and 80s. You were doing so in the face of science, in the face of what seemed like natural law, and that made it very, very hard to sustain any kind of support for African Americans past that point.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, especially through the lens of like social Darwinism, for example. I mean, we
Yeah,
see in American history with the Scopes trial that like for a lot of people, it was a fight against social Darwinism, not as much evolution. And I think if you have such a widespread belief, not just in America but throughout the entire world, that black people are inherently inferior, biologically inferior, it makes kind of defending that supposed science very difficult. And I think that that is probably where a lot of the tension from what freedom means for African Americans probably came from.
yeah, yeah. I think you're right.
And kind of moving on, when we debate citizenship and voting rights today, are we still grappling with the questions that emerged during Reconstruction, or have we kind of shifted past that? Are we in a new era now?
Um, I think if you don't understand Reconstruction and its history, it makes it very hard for you to appreciate what's happening in the 21st century. Um, so many of the terms of debate that would go on to dominate um, modern American history right up through the 20th and into the 21st century. So many of those debates were forged during Reconstruction. So, the relationship between individuals and the state, the relationship between individuals and law enforcement, um, the laws that were passed in the wake of the war about vagrancy and about what rights the state had to imprison people based largely on the fact that they were out of work. So many of those laws are counted as draconian, but so many of those laws would also inform things like the prison system in the United States and the disproportionate number of people of color who end up in prison. Um, the kind of the industrial scale of that. So much of it would be informed by Reconstruction policy. It's also the case that drug laws, the drug wars of the 1980s and 90s. So much of the legal blueprint for that war was drawn up from materials that were from Reconstruction itself. So there's so many things that you can see parallels and you can draw connections between them. It's hard when you do that, of course, to sort of take a moment out of time and say, well, that's the origin story, and that's the only reason. Obviously, things have changed. Um, it's hard to find clear historical parallels, but the parallels do exist, and I think that it makes it all the more important to study Reconstruction. I think because of just how consequential it was, and just how so many of the ideas and so many of the definitions that we use today to understand the world around us um, were effectively forged during during Reconstruction. So yeah, I think it's a really important period of the country's history to study.
I I definitely agree, and I think most juniors in high school, most 11th graders, spend a decent chunk of time talking about Reconstruction. What lessons from Reconstruction do you think are most important for younger audience in an effort to try to understand democracy then and democracy today?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, or the thing that I spend the most amount of time talking about when I teach the subject, is that Reconstruction is a story of political mobilization, and it's a mobilization of the masses, and that's what led to its success. Emancipation didn't happen just because Abraham Lincoln thought about it and put pen to paper.
Yeah.
Um, the Reconstruction amendments didn't happen because members of Congress were, looked to the better angels of their nature and decided to make a change. Um, those things happened because people pushed, and because people mobilized, and because people made it harder and harder for those in power to stick to the status quo. They demanded change, and that's what they ended up getting. Now, they didn't get all the change that they wanted, and they didn't get all the things that they sought, but they did achieve change. And the only way to do that was through mass mobilization, through bringing together lots and lots of people and paying attention to what they wanted and listening to them and building a movement. And that was the lesson of Reconstruction that people from the civil rights movement drew from that history. That you're only going to get somewhere if you mobilize the people. It's all well and good to give speeches, but you have to mobilize people. You have to make people believe that they can make a change for themselves. And it's so often the case in history that we don't focus on that. We focus on the great figures of history, and it allows us to feel as though we can't change anything. We have to wait for someone important to decide to lead. When in reality, Reconstruction teaches you that you don't have to wait. you can make a change. You can. It's messy and it's hard work and it's at times filled with setbacks, but the change can happen if and only if you're able to gather people together. And I think that's probably the most important thing about Reconstruction's history is that that facet of it that reminds us just how important the individual can be. You know, the ordinary person, how important they can be. I think that's why Reconstruction matters.